We had Soros expert Richard Poe on our program to talk about the European debt and the European crisis and what Soros would gain if the euro collapses. And I asked Richard to come down to our studio here in Dallas so he could lay out something that he had said that he thought was in store for America before the election, based on what Soros has done in the past to countries all around the world. I want you to know this is the name of the book. It's ShadowParty. This was 2006?
Yes.
The research was done in about 2004. So this isn't about the president. This isn't about any of this. This research was done in 2004.
Some of it.
Some of it. Well, 2004 or 5, but definitely before 6. Nobody had any idea that Obama would be the president at that time. Probably Spooky Dude did, but nobody had any. So it's not about the president. But it is about this election to you, this coming election, right? That it is about a fundamental transformation and finishing of the job, do you think, honestly, by this next election?
Well, I think they certainly will try to finish the job by this next election. Whether they succeed or not is another question. What we saw when we wrote this book is the plan that George Soros and his network had for America. They were very clear about this plan already in 2004. They were saying it clearly. And so when they finally succeed in accomplishing what they set out to accomplish, that's another question. We don't know that. We can't see the future. But the plan that they laid out was very clear already in 2004, and they had already done it in many other countries. And
they have actually, where have they actually said this plan about America? Have they actually said this plan that you're going to lay out in so many words, or just in their actions?
Well, in 2004, George Soros began giving a lot of interviews to the press. That's when he came out against George Bush. And at that time, he said clearly that what I have done in various other countries now has to be done here in the United States. And he was clearly saying that he was going to enact the plan that is described in that book.
Because when he decides that a regime is oppressive, he goes in to collapse it. And most people don't have a problem with it because it has happened before with communist countries.
Yes.
But now he is on record saying, this is what's going to happen. I'll do it the way I did before. So why don't you lay it out and show me what's coming? Because you contend the way he always does it before is right before a huge election.
Sure.
Okay.
Well, these are the 5 steps. We call them 5 steps for overthrowing a government. This is what Soros has specialized in doing for decades in various countries around the world. And when
you say form a shadow government, what does that mean?
A shadow government is a government in the wings. He infiltrates a country with his own operatives, putting them in all levels of life, in politics, in medicine, in academia, in journalism, and also in the very critical areas of the armed forces and intelligence services and police services. That's a very important part of the process for obvious reasons.
That's the only part of the process I haven't been able to find, except through the unions. But I haven't been able to find his influence in the government. Have you? I mean, in the military. Have you?
No, I can't say specifically in the United States that I have seen the evidence of it.
Yeah, okay, you've seen the evidence of it?
I'm saying I have not found it.
Okay. But he has done it in other countries. We know that.
Yes.
Yes. Okay. So the next one is control the airwaves.
Yes, and when Soros and his team target a country for one of these regime changes, they always start some kind of media operation, typically a radio station or sometimes a TV station, which is under Soros's ownership or direct control in one way or another.
Did he do that with Pacifica? Is Pacifica his? Here in
I don't know. I haven't kept track of that.
Yeah, I think Tiffany, find out if Pacifica is under his direct control, but I know that he is also funding journalists here in America
Yes.
at the national and local level.
Yes, he's acquired in America a very high profile in all kinds of media operations at all levels in the United States.
Okay.
But often when he goes to the less developed countries, all he needs is a little radio station, and that enables him to reach everyone in the country, and that's what he needs. And step 3 is to destabilize the state, which can be done by causing an economic crisis or perhaps taking advantage of an existing crisis that just happens along.
I contend he's done both of those here. He's, through his Apollo Alliance, which he was involved with, he helped make the economic crisis that we're in by just spending, I mean, it'll be $5 trillion by the time, in the next, this 4 years, $5 trillion. And he has also taken advantage of the existing crisis that we had with the housing market.
Correct,
right?
yes.
Okay.
Step 4 is to provoke an election crisis. What this means is that he waits for an election, and then when the election takes place, he declares that the election is fraudulent, that the opposite side, his opponents, are stealing the election. He uses his controlled radio or TV stations to blast this message around the country. He uses his shadow government and shadow, I guess it's part of the shadow government, but he has street activists who go out in the street and create a big ruckus, saying the election's being stolen.
He already has this, and what gave him the idea was it's the the Save Our State, and it's the state attorney generals, and he has gone in and funded SOS and all the people who verify elections. He's tried to get his people in there, and he's formed this whole thing, and he got the idea in the 2000 election. So there's your shadow government on an election crisis. You have the people out in the streets to cause chaos, but it's people also like MoveOn.org, et cetera, that cry out fraud. So the election crisis, we know they have the ability to do that.
Yes.
Yes, okay.
And once you provoke the election crisis, then you go to stage 5, is that you stage massive demonstrations. You put all these activists out in the street crying voter fraud, and they demand to change the election result. Now, in Yugoslavia in 2000, for example, he had a group called Otpor, which had somewhere around 70,000 activists. He put those people out in the street saying that the election was being stolen. Now, in this case, he actually had armed units. This Otpor had units blocking roads around Belgrade who were armed with AK-47s, mortars, anti-tank, shoulder-launched rockets, and so forth and so on. The protesters in the streets were armed with all kinds of Molotov cocktails and weapons of that, homemade weapons of that sort. They burned down the Parliament building. I think a couple people were killed in that incident. So these are often called bloodless coups, these things that Soros does. But in the case of Yugoslavia and some others, they were not bloodless at all, nor were they in any way nonviolent. And so what they did is they had the whole capital surrounded by these armed units. They had these violent protesters storming through the streets, burning down buildings, and so forth, and creating a huge ruckus. And what was their issue? The issue was that Milosevic, the sitting president, was running against a man named Kostanovic. Kostanovic came in with something like, I think it was 48, 49%. Milosevic was actually losing. Both sides appeared to have been engaged in fraud. Now, so far, everything was according to the Yugoslav constitution. Nobody was breaking any laws or violating the constitution. The Yugoslav constitution at that time said that if you don't have a candidate with a 50% plurality, then you have a second election, a runoff election. Instead of allowing the constitution to play out, they put these protesters in the street and they canceled the runoff election. They said, forget the election. We want Kostanovic. We want Milosevic out. Forget the election. Forget the Constitution. Forget the constitutional process. Kostanovic will be our man. And they simply pressed in this violent manner until they got what they wanted. There was no second election. The Constitution was broken and discarded. Milosevic was arrested and sent off as a war criminal to Holland, where he later allegedly hanged himself in his cell.
Wow, well, that's a happy ending here. All of these things, except for step one, I think, are complete because of the military. But many in the police were duped by the massive demonstrations. I mean, the massive demonstrations. We know who those demonstrators are, right? They're the Occupy Wall Street people.
Yes.
And they have been bought and paid for, much to most of them not even paying attention and knowing it. Bought and paid for in many ways by George Soros and his friends, and it's his friends and family network.
Correct.
Correct. What makes you think that this is going to happen now? That this is the time for this? I mean, don't get me wrong. I'm asking you this in hopes that you're wrong. I'm hoping for more time, but I don't know if you're wrong. What makes you think this is it?
Well, I hope I'm wrong too.
Right.
But the fact that what you were just talking about earlier, the fact that we have all these world leaders, quote unquote, in Davos now saying that we have a perfect storm. The fact that Soros himself in the last few days has been making very alarming public statements, saying things to the effect that the euro is going to collapse and the whole European Union, the European experiment is going to go off a cliff. He's been saying, for example, that he said then when this financial contagion spreads to the United States, Soros saying this again, that there will be riots in the streets in America and possibly a repressive police state crackdown in the United States, and making predictions of an extremely alarming nature to the media. And this type of statement can only serve one purpose, which is to create fear, alarm, and some kind of reaction. You know, it's a panic, or perhaps some other kind of reaction, getting people very angry and ready to fight.
Okay, so when we come back, pressure from above and below. This is top down, bottom up, inside out that we've talked about on the program before, as Van Jones talks about it. But that actually has some a real spooky heritage that George Soros is very well aware of.
Yes.
In the 1950s, and Richard will show us one more thing, and that is what has to happen. I'll take you to the second chalkboard. What has to happen for this to work? And you just ask yourself, do these things sound crazy? Next.
Beck.
All right, I want to talk to you a little bit about top down, bottom up, inside out. This is what Van Jones has talked about for a long time, and all of the SCIU guys and everything else. Top down, put people in the government, and they start to put pressure in the middle. And they start to come down and put pressure. That's what's happening now with the Catholic Church and everything else. Put pressure. Then also orchestrate rebels at the bottom. So the rebels start to mix with the normal people who are really kind of pissed off. Top down, bottom rises up. Then the middle says, help us, help us, help us. And then the top really comes down, crushes, and then turns the whole thing inside out, and you have a new country. That's what the left, their plan. That's Van Jones. Top down, bottom up, inside out. We showed you on Fox on the week that we did the Puppet Master, the George Soros thing, that some claim was the end of my career. We showed you something else. I understand top down, bottom up, inside out. Inside out. I know that, like the back of my hand. I'm just not sure which is the back of my hand. It's this part. Richard knows, because he's been studying Soros, Soros, you have to go back not to the contemporary language, but you really have to go back to what he experienced early on. And when you see, you know this theory, wait until you hear Richard talk about pressure from above and below. This is from 1957. Richard.
Well, I want to say that this term pressure from above and below, as far as I can tell, it was first used by Vladimir Lenin himself in talking about the Russian Revolution. And I had heard it from various places, but when we were writing the ShadowParty, my co-author, David Horowitz, actually brought this up to me, and he said, and David Horowitz was one of the leaders of the New Left in the 1960s, and he said, you know, we should really mention pressure from above and below. He said, we always used to talk about that amongst us radicals in the 60s. And I had heard this term, but I was very pleased that he urged me to go into it, because I thought at that time only conspiracy theorists used this term, and that I'd be discredited if I talked about it. It's really been kept under wraps. And what it is very fascinating. The way I would explain it, actually, I find people can understand it. If you look in the Gospels, in the Bible, because it's not, people often say it's a communist tactic, which it is, but it actually goes back to the beginning of time. You can find it in the Bible when Jesus was tried by Pontius Pilate, and Pilate brought him out and said to the crowd, "This man seems innocent to me," and the crowd said, "Crucify him, crucify him." It says in two of the Gospels, in Matthew and I think Luke, it says that the high priests and their scribes were were egging this crowd on and stirring them up.
And they're up at the top.
Yes, so, and this is pressure from above and below. It's right there in the Bible from 2,000 years ago, the same tactic. The high priests and the temple officials at the top, being the government of that time, and then this crowd yelling, "Crucify him, crucify him." For what reason? Because the ones at the top were telling them what to say. Because in fact, if we believe the Bible, those of us who do, Jesus was a very popular figure amongst the masses on the street in Jerusalem. It wasn't their nature to say, "Crucify him, crucify him." This was a hand-picked crowd. It was an artificial crowd picked, according to the Bible, by the top. And so the top said, "We want him crucified, but we don't want to say it ourselves because he's popular. So let's put a crowd together in the street to say, 'Crucify him.'" And
Which allows, in today's world, which allows anytime this happens, for all of the elites, all of the rulers, all of the media to say, this is what the people, this is democracy. This is what the people want. They cried out for it. They wanted it. It wasn't imposed.
Exactly. Right. That's exactly what it does. It creates the illusion that, look, there's all these people in the street who want something. They want communism, or they want whatever. And
fairness,
it's not what people
justice.
really want. But for most of us who have jobs and families and don't have time to be out in the street, we don't know what to do about that. There's crowds yelling, "Crucify him," and the temple officials are, you know, saying, well, we'd better go along and crucify him. And so he gets crucified, even though it's not what most people want. That's pressure from above and below. It's been going on for thousands of years. Lenin picked up on it, and in 1957, at a conference in London, this Czech, I think he was a political scientist, he was some sort of communist official from Czechoslovakia, Jan Kozak, he presented a paper explaining how they had used this pressure from above and below to install communism in 1948 without shedding a single drop of blood. They simply, of course, they had the Soviet occupying forces in there, and so no one wanted to go against them. But they had the communists at the top who were paying and supporting these communist agitators at the bottom, who were marching around and creating all kinds of havoc, saying, "We want communism, we want communism." And then there were the majority of people who
didn't want it.
They didn't want it, but they weren't going to fight the government with the Soviet troops backing them, and they were terrified by all these communists marching around in the streets. And so they got squished between the government and the communist agitators, and they ended up with communism.
And nobody knew about it at the time. I mean, the people in it knew, but the average person didn't know that this was being orchestrated, that they were being used.
They didn't understand what was happening. They saw all these people around them crying out for communism, and for a lot of people, you know, when they see other people doing something, they just start thinking, well, gee, maybe all my neighbors like communism, and people get afraid to talk to each other too, so you're not really sure who shares these ideas and who doesn't. Are you going to go to your neighbor on the left, on the right, and say, do you agree with those protesters? I mean, I don't go around my neighborhood asking who agrees with the Occupy Wall Streeters.
That's why it's important for the government to control the internet and be able to say, you gotta remove them from Google search. It's why the president said, you see something, say something. You see somebody who's spreading false rumors, you tell the White House. Remember, they tried to do that at the very beginning. One of the important things that Americans have never had, and if we lose it, we're in trouble, and that is we've never had a distrust for our neighbor. Every other country, especially European, they shut up because you don't know if your neighbor is going to be a spy and turn you in on something.
Exactly.
And so we've never had that problem, and that's where everybody says, America, they're so trusting. Yeah, and that's why we've lasted so long. Once we start to distrust, once we start to say they can turn me in or will turn me in, then it automatically accelerates because people are afraid to move.
Yes.
Correct?
Yes.
Okay.
And the whole point of the tactic is to create fear, is to create fear and confusion. So everyone sees that there's all this violence and threat of violence and this great movement asking for something they don't want.
Let me just throw this in because he brought up the Gospels. He just used two key words, fear and confusion. Let me add another one, chaos. God is not the author of that. Anybody who is trying to put fear, confusion, and create chaos is on the wrong side. Really easy way to figure out. There may be spooky things that people say. You're a spooky dude saying this kind of stuff. I mean, I'm not the spooky dude, but you are a spooky dude. You saying these things, scary. And it can create fear. Truth will make you miserable first, but it will set you free. It's fear, confusion. Is this easy to follow? Can you easily track all of this stuff down? Can you look for these sources and see, yes, it's true? Does it create more confusion if you understand this, or does it clarify things? Would you agree with that? As one of the judges, if it clarifies things for you, you know who the author might be. If it doesn't, you definitely know who the author is. That's why when we explain the progressive era, when things start to make sense, when you understand Marxists in America and the progressive era movement, it doesn't create more confusion. It explains almost everything.
Yeah.
All right, real quick, go here on what this list is.
Well, I think this is simply explaining what Soros is telling us with all these alarming statements. The southern EU countries are almost certainly going to default as part of this perfect storm.
Yes.
And I should mention that the president of the European Commission 2 years ago in 2010 actually made an astonishing statement. This crisis was already going on. He said that if these countries don't get their act together, they are going to have dictatorships in these countries. He actually said this. It was published in the British press and maybe elsewhere. This is the president of the European Commission, Barroso. He's still the president today. This is the executive branch of the European Union government. He said if these countries, Spain, Portugal, Greece, and maybe Italy, if they don't get their act together, they are going to have dictators. That was a threat.
Yeah, and nobody paid attention, and they will. And they will.
That was a threat. Now, this will, when these countries default, this will cause a run on the banks in the wealthier EU countries because they'll be trying to bail out these countries.
And they're already lining up in Italy. They're lining up and they're trying to stop all the run on the banks. There's now already a new rule in the banks that you can't take 10,000 euros out, and not from notification. You can't take it out. Right. More than 10,000 euros, and you can no longer spend and buy something in cash for more than 1,300 euros. That's significant. That's to stop the run on the banks. They know it's coming.
Right.
Okay.
When the banks in Europe start going under, the major banks, the U.S. will, of course, bail them out, as we always bail out banks. And then our banks will be under pressure and will likely collapse, almost certainly. By that means the financial contagion will have spread to the United States, as Mr. Soros has predicted in the last few days. He then has predicted there will be riots in the streets. He's in a very good place, Mr. Soros, to predict this because, as you pointed out, he has many of the rioters on his payroll now in groups that he has founded and funded who have been trained in camps for years for activism in the streets of this source. So he's telling us there are going to be riots. And by the way, The Nation magazine sent out an email saying that they were giving seminars in how to organize a flash mob. I've gotten that email a couple of times. I guess they'll cancel my subscription now. The U.S. government then will crack down, according to Mr. Soros. He says there will be a police state crackdown, repression like we've never had in this country.
That will violate the principles of the U.S. Constitution.
Yes.
Yeah, that's what he said.
That's what he has promised us. That's what he's predicted. And all this in a year when we're having a presidential election. We're supposed to have an election.
Is he putting, did you see him put a time period on this?
I did not.
Okay, because I didn't see a time period either. But if this is the way he always does it, then it is in the next year, you know, because you would have the election and then you would have to cry fraud and everything else. So you would have this in the next year. It fits nicely in this year. And it also kind of explains why this administration hasn't seemed worried at all about an election.
Yes, and there may be another reason, with which I'll conclude, because what if there isn't an election? You know, I live in New York. I was there when 9/11 happened, and we had a mayoral election coming up. Giuliani was running and in November, and a lot of people were saying it's going to be called off. They were saying, look what's happened, we can't have an election. And Giuliani, to his credit, said, no, we're going ahead with the election anyway. But a lot of people were very prepared to just call it off.
Right.
And so if there is a crisis and a crackdown sufficiently severe, they may try that on a national level, and they won't have a Giuliani to nobly say, I will go up for re-election.
That would be remarkable. Richard, thank you so much.
Thank
Appreciate
you.
it. The name of the book is The ShadowParty. It's many years old, but it is worth a read to know what you're dealing with. And we tell you this kind of stuff because somebody has to have the truth, have all of the facts. This is something that you should have in hard copy. Somebody has to have all of the facts. So when it happens, it's not you going, no, and I saw this guy on GBTV, and then it's all discredited. You have to know the facts. You were just telling me before we went on the air that you know, Jan Kozak in 1957 wrote about this, and I have just the best researchers in the world, but you said you knew about it, you could find pieces of it, but you could never find the actual document, and we found the actual document from my research staff, and now I have to know. I didn't know it was that hard to find. They probably did. We'll have to make sure that we have the original document on hand all the time. That's the kind of stuff that you need, because otherwise it's third hand, and somebody has to know the truth. God forbid any of this stuff happens. Thank you.